begin with our first session, Be Prepared, led by Steph Barnaby and Amanda Sand. Steph Barnaby is the IDEAS, that's Information Delivery and Access Services librarian at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and is the chair-elect of the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Roundtable, the IFRT. She received her master's in Library and Information Science from San Jose State University's School of Information in 2018. She previously worked at the Feynman and Pappas Law Libraries at Boston University's School of Law as the evening library supervisor. She's been an active member of IFRT, serving in nearly every committee of IFRT since 2016. She's currently pursuing a master's in higher education administration. She loves to fill her limited spare time with her favorites, books, vegan comfort food, traveling, meeting new people, coffee, music, and Doctor Who. Amanda Sand has dedicated 15 years to working in libraries. In 2018 and 2019, she faced multiple challenges to LGBTQIA+ materials in her library, including an incident where a patron checked out and burned library books. This experience propelled her into an intellectual freedom advocacy at local, state, and national levels. Amanda has been a leading voice in protecting access to information, serving as a member and chair of the Iowa Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Committee and the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Roundtable. She now serves on ALA's Intellectual Freedom Committee. Amanda recently transitioned from her position as a public library director to focus on intellectual freedom advocacy and consulting. Thank you so much for joining us, Steph and Amanda. The floor is yours.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Waiting for Steph to get our slides up for us and we will get started on our session. I'm wondering if we need to stop. There we go. We have a lot to cover with you today, Steph and I do. We had some really great introductions already from Heather, so we're gonna skip right over that and move right on to a discussion of kind of the current challenge landscape very, very briefly. Then we're gonna talk about creating policies with some specific subheadings there, training and resources for both the training and revamping your library policies.
Okay, I'm going to kick things off with some foundational information about what we're talking about and what the current situation is in libraries today, so we're all using the same language. We'd like to start off by talking about 3 different terms that will provide a baseline for this session. The first is complaint. This is informal and is simply an expression of a personal point of view. Challenge is the formal word meaning an attempt to have a library resource removed or for access to be restricted to the resource based on the objections of a person or a group. Bans are the removal of materials from a library based on the objections of a person or a group and are a result. This means we're often concerned with book challenges because they are formal requests for items to be banned. And those challenges come from different places than they have done in the past. This infographic from ALA is available in the State of America's Libraries Report 2025 and reports statistics from the year 2024. Nearly 72% of censorship attempts in 2024 were initiated by pressure groups and decision makers who have been swayed by them. This includes elected officials, government bodies, pressure groups, and boards or administrators. Challenges also targeted more than just books. One reason why you need to be prepared for challenges of all kinds, no matter your library type. Legal disclaimer, speaking from our experience, your local laws may vary, so always have legal counsel review policies. Policies and procedures are necessary to have in advance. Policies help staff know what to do, help users know what to expect, and help everyone know their rights and responsibilities. They help the process move fairly and efficiently. They mitigate risk of litigation or the cost of litigation, and can help accusations of unfairness or unequal treatment not happen. The first policy that we're going to discuss, and that you may already be aware of, is a collection development policy. These are guidelines libraries use for the selection, purchasing, and deselection of materials. The policy assists library workers in building a collection that aligns with the library's mission and can be made public to inform library users about the guidelines the library uses. When crafting a collection development policy, there's a number of areas that you'd want to cover and parts you'd want to include. The purpose for the services provided by the library is a good place to start. The criteria and process of selecting items for the collection should be included. You will also want to articulate who has responsibility for collection decisions and what your library's users need and how they can request items to be included. The collection development policy is also a great place to include statements about intellectual freedom. The collection development policy isn't the only tool you can use to fill your arsenal, though. Here's Amanda with more.
Thanks, Steph. One of the things that I think we often overlook is the amount of challenges that are happening to non-book materials and non-book resources in our libraries. So as you are considering your reconsideration policy and your the other policies that you have guiding the services and resources that are provided in your library, you should also be thinking about how you would address a challenge to those materials or resources. So what we often commonly think of in terms of challenges is books. However, films, digital resources, displays, consortial purchases as opposed to individual library purchases, programs, and even policy decisions are things that your patrons might bring to you a complaint that could turn into a challenge. You could have either individual policies for each of these, and in some cases, you should have individual policies for these things, but you could also try and craft a reconsideration policy that covers all of those bases. Next slide, thanks. So I'm going to spend some time talking about how different services and resources have different complications. I don't want to use the word challenges, might have different complications as you are considering having them in your library and how to respond to challenges. And also the types of things that you probably want to have in your policy so that you can point to them in the case of a complaint or a challenge. So when you're dealing with programs and program policies, I would recommend that your policy address things like, what organizations are you going to partner with? How are those decisions made? Do you charge fees? And if so, are they able to be waived? If so, how do you make those decisions? It can be complicated when working with a program challenge because they can be much more time sensitive than a material challenge. It might be that someone drops a challenge form on your director's desk the week before you have a guest speaker coming in. What are you going to do in that situation? What sort of timeline will you be working on? Are you going to carry on with the program? As long as there are no direct safety concerns, are you going to reschedule? If you are going to change anything, who makes that decision? Do you need to call a special board meeting? Of course, the physical safety of your staff, attendees, and performers are of the highest priority when dealing with anything happening in your library, and the risks there should also be a part of your decision making and things that you should be thinking about ahead of time. Programs can also be highly personal to staff. Unlike material selection, it is very common for staff members' names to be published alongside the programs that they are doing, and so that can open them up to criticism or threats or other unpleasant situations in a way that your collection development librarians may not face. If you're going to be considering challenges to your policies and how those have been written and the decisions that your board has made. Always, you need to be aware of your applicable local, state, and federal laws, in addition to what you and your library think are the best course of action. Also, community standards, as we discuss intellectual freedom topics, is a phrase that comes up a lot, and it has to do with it's one prong of the Miller test, I believe. And in the internet age, community standards has really expanded beyond just your local physical community. I think that the article Intellectual Freedom in Libraries Then and Now by Henry Cohen and Mary Minow, which was published in Advances in Librarianship, is a really great resource if you want to learn more about what that means, and can be really helpful as you discuss the way that you're writing your policies. Also, and this is true of all of your policies and how you write things, you should be aware of what your board or municipality's affinity for risk is. I tend to be fairly risk averse in a lot of personal things and willing to take more risk in professional spaces. But I know that the risks that we're willing to take as library professionals is not always the same risks that our boards or cities are comfortable with. When you have displays in your library, whether those are created by library staff members or made up of contributions of your community members, those can have very different implications for how your policy is written, how concerns about those things can be raised, and how you would reconsider those things. Also, your policy should address whether these are digital displays, something like a list that's been curated in your ILS and your discovery layer, whether it is, on the front table right as you walk in the doors. All of your policies should, just like with your collection development policies, address the fact that anything that is on display is not being endorsed by the library. It is being just displayed as part of a theme. One thing that can be hard about displays, especially, is that they represent a moment in time. So in any moment in time in the library that I'm sitting in right now, there is a Booktober, Cooktober display. There's a Diverse Voices display. There's some fun romance displays. And what you can see right now does not necessarily represent the diversity of displays that happen throughout the year. One way that I think is great to be able to address those concerns from a data and factual point of view, as opposed to an observational point of view, is to sit down and decide what all of your displays are going to be for the year in advance, or to keep a retroactive list of all of the displays that you do, so that if a patron comes up to you and has a concern, you can pull out your little bookmark that says, here's all the things we've planned for this year, here's what we've done, here's what's coming. You can put that one particular display into context and show that you are representing a lot more points of view throughout the year. They just might not be on display right now. Digital resources have their own challenges as well. Often we're collecting those as packages and we're not selecting individual titles. So who is responsible for that, and how much power do you have to change that will really determine how decisions are made when challenges arise. So the Libby consortium that my most recent library was a part of, we had materials that were selected as just kind of the base package by Overdrive. We were also part of a statewide consortium. So the state library and a set of their volunteers would select materials, but then we also have the opportunity to provide Advantage titles as well. So for just that one digital collection, there were multiple decision makers, and we had only a certain amount of power over certain titles that were available. I also think that your policies should address the fact that our vendor content ratings and controls are not endorsed by the library, the same way that you might say that film ratings are not endorsements by the library. When it comes to social media, I think that this could be a part of your conduct in the library policy, kind of addressing all engagement with and in library locations or library places. But you could also have your own specific social media policy. It might address what sorts of things you publish, what sorts of things you republish on the behalf of other organizations, Acceptable behavior by people visiting your social media pages. If you open your social media page up to public comment, you are creating a limited public forum, and that can be really hard to walk back. How are you going to moderate, and who are you going to allow to participate? Are all questions that your policy should address. Last of all, I believe, yes, checking my notes. Last of all is public meeting participation. This is something that I have encountered in my direct support of other libraries undergoing challenges or expecting community pushback, is how do we make sure that our meetings don't get out of hand? And I think that having a clear and fair procedure and policy about how members of the public participate in your public meetings in advance is really important and will save everyone a lot of anxiety. So even laying out something as simple as how do you indicate that you want to speak at a meeting? Do you have to sign in on a sign-in sheet? Do you get a card? Do you contact someone in advance? I probably wouldn't do that. But what sorts of behavior are acceptable and what would be considered disruptive? Are you going to implement time limits? And that time limit could be per person. It could be for the entire public comment section. And providing alternative modes of contact if you're not able to make it to a meeting or not able to speak at a particular meeting are important so that your community members can be engaged with the process of running the library. I think these are especially helpful as your library board presidents who may or may not feel very comfortable or confident in these situations, moderating and kind of making sure that the situation stays at kind of a non-disruptive level. Having guidelines for that and announcing them, putting them on your agenda, linking to them from your agenda, publishing them in the room or making it available are all ways to just set expectations so that everyone knows what to expect and that everyone is being treated fairly and equally. So as you're getting started with revising your challenge or reconsideration policies or writing one from scratch, first of all, what is a challenge or reconsideration policy? Again, this is probably something that you all know, but it is the procedure. It is a policy that lays out how a challenge is raised and how a challenge is responded to. So what you will probably have in your and should have in your reconsideration policy is the requirements for how to start that process. Who is going to make the decisions, who's going to do the research, who's going to look at the policy, who's going to look at the item or the resource and make a recommendation, what criteria it is that they're supposed to use throughout that process. How quickly are you going to complete this process? How are you going to and how often are you going to communicate with a complainant? And is there an appeals procedure and what does that look like? I also think that there are ways that you can protect your staff, your organization in your policies. One recommendation that I have, if possible, not every state allows you to do this, but in my library, I did not have the reconsideration form on my library's website. You had to come in and talk to a staff member, and then you had a conversation with me, the library director, before a form would be provided to you. If that wasn't possible, or they were just, really adamant that they wanted the form, of course they could have the form. But we wanted to try and open with a conversation about their concerns about the materials before it got to the point of being a challenge. I also think that everyone should be adopting ALA statements as their guiding documents. So things like the freedom to read statement, the freedom to view statement, our professional ethics, and the Library Bill of Rights are all things that would be great for your board to adopt and can be connected to your collection development and other applicable policies. I do want to note that almost all, if not all, of the interpretations of the Library Bill of Rights have been updated in the last several months and approved by ALA's council. While the content of most of those remains the same, what did change primarily is that everything has been changed into plain language, so it should be a lot more accessible for boards, members of the public to use. You can also put residency requirements on your challenges. The challenges I experienced often came from outside of my county and outside of my service area from folks who seemed to be looking to make a point. But you can limit who can challenge. I would also recommend either a time limit before you challenge. A challenge to the same material can be considered again. I would also put the caveat on that perhaps if you do an update to your collection development policy or other applicable policy, after that point, a material could be reconsidered even if the time limit has not passed. Last of all, and this is one of my favorite things, and I thank my predecessor at the Dubuque County Library for this, is putting together a reconsideration committee that does not just rely on your own staff. I think this is a really great way to shield your staff from the negativity and the attention and the blame for being a collection development librarian. So the committee that would be a part of the policy of the library I most recently worked at, it was the library director, a member of the board, and a library professional whose job includes collection development. We always intended for that to be someone who does not work at our library, who is in another potentially academic library that can just bring a little bit more neutrality to the situation and more professionalism without it being so personal and tied to their own work. So here are some other, this is a lot of what we already just said, but on like one nice little slide. Things that your policy should address as you're looking at this potentially holistically and trying to figure out what this process should look like. You need to be determining how is a challenge initiated, who is the decision maker, what are the timelines. I think timelines are very important so that you don't, especially in the situation where you might have multiple challenges coming through at once. You could put in your policy that we will look at 2 challenges per month. And if you submit 20 of them, it's going to take us 10 months to get through them. But you can find ways to protect your staff and your board from overwhelm with things like this. Also, will you allow anything to change while the challenge moves forward? Ideally, the answer to that is no. However, I know that often with safety concerns, that is not a realistic choice. Also, are you going to require that they read the entire item, view the entire item, show up to a public meeting? All those kinds of things are things that you should think about and decide what works best for the workflow of your library. Here are 2 examples of procedures and how this process might work in your library. And a lot of libraries will look very similar to this. A lot of them will look very different. So for example, the example 1 is more like the way that my previous library and my previous policy was written. Too many P's in that sentence. First, the complainant has to speak with the library director. If they're not satisfied, only then do they get the form. Then we form a committee, review it, make a recommendation. The director then makes a decision and informs the person who made the initial complaint, and they are free to appeal to the board. An alternative is that you just allow them to fill out the form right off the bat. And then it goes to a selector for that collection area or potentially a different collection area to review the policy, review the item, and make a recommendation to the director who makes a decision and informs the complainant, and then still allowing an appeal to the board. It's also possible that just the board makes a decision and it is not able to be appealed. Back to Steph.
Now that we've talked through the different policies and procedures, it's important to spread the word about these by training not just your library staff, but also your board. What should you include in your training? Everyone benefits from basic intellectual freedom and privacy explanations. You'll also want to cover the details of the policies and procedures that are in place at your library. Role play can be useful, using practice cases of scenarios that could actually occur in your library. It's also helpful to go over who does what and the individual roles that different parts of your library community play, from frontline staff to your trustees. Potential issues that can arise that it's a good idea to plan for in advance of trainings are conflicts between professional and personal ethics, varying levels of responsibility felt to uphold tenets of intellectual freedom or generally of participation, and different interpretations of both policies and ethics. Here we have some links that should all be available in the PDF to some training resources for trustees or library staff. I can also drop these in the chat. We have training from Niche Academy, Web Junction, put on by different library associations, and are good options if you want to send something to someone. It's important to note that different organizations will have different stakeholders who might need to be consulted, contribute to policy decision-making, or need to be alerted about related situations. We've included a non-exhaustive list of potential stakeholders on this slide that could apply to a variety of different library types. You'll want to do some thinking about your own library and who needs to be involved. We have frontline service staff, volunteers, student employees, school boards, board of trustees, parents groups, student groups, friends of the library, faculty senate, consortial partners, marketing departments, and administrators. We know there's a lot of resources out there, so we've compiled some of them here. Being prepared means having multiple tools in your toolkit, including applicable federal laws. We have the First and Fourth Amendment stuck on this slide. State laws, you can ask your state law library or law librarian for help, or consult general counsel for your institution. Your institutional policies might apply. Example policies, which will be on the next slide, and staff and trustee training resources were on the last slide. It's also a good idea to have some community messaging inspiration available to see how different kinds of ways of describing things to your community might be best for the community. There's also several amazing resources from ALA and the Office for Intellectual Freedom, including the Selection and Reconsideration Policy Toolkit for Public School and Academic Libraries from ALA, how to respond to challenges and concerns about library policy, and a variety of documentation resources. So the Code of Ethics, including Q&As and interpretations, the Freedom to Read statement and the Freedom to View statement, the Library Bill of Rights, and the associated interpretations about that. Also, it's important to report challenges. There is an ALA form. You might also report to your individual states. And we can also put these in the chat, but the links should be live. And here we have some examples of policies at different types of libraries. The important thing to note is that there's a wide variety of ways and formats these policies can have. So even among different public libraries, the policies might look really different or be presented in different ways. It's also possible that some of these policies might not be available on like a website. So this is a selection of public, academic, and school library policies. Here's a selection of important contacts to have saved, which is nice to have in your toolkit, but stick around for the next session where Joyce goes in depth about next steps when you receive a challenge, which might impact which number, resource, or contact you want to address. I think we're actually running ahead of schedule too, so.
We are, which is great because there are some really good questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to hop and talk about the question, would you recommend a binder with previous displays and material highlighted on those displays for those complaints that come about in current displays? I think there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. If your library's ILS system allows for list creation, I think that can be a handy way to retain that information in a system that you already have. So the library that I learned this from first is the Waterloo Public Library here in Iowa. And like I said, they just do, this is this year's set of displays that we're going to do. And honestly, I'm not sure if they retain all the materials that went on that display, but at least you can talk about the topic and what that display covered. You could also just keep this as a spreadsheet. You could publish it on your website. You could just keep it available as a staff only viewable item unless a concern comes up. But if a binder is what works for you and your workflow, then go right ahead. But I do think that if you are going to have some things, you know, like during Pride Month, a library that I know does kind of more of a love theme and do like all kinds of romance novels that run the gamut of human attraction and sexuality. And so even though the theme might be love, there is kind of the point in there that it's also Pride Month. So having a list of what items were on that display, or at least part of that display at one point in time, can also be a good offensive measure, I would say, in terms of keeping good records so you can put those questions or complaints into context. The next question, by they, in reading the entire item, do you mean the complainant or the reviewer? I mean the complainant when I say that, or at least in the context of whatever it is that I said when I said that. I personally have mixed feelings about whether to make people read or watch things that they find objectionable just so that they can complain about it. But I also understand that the point of making people read things is so that they understand the full context of what it is that they are complaining about. So that is something where I would talk to and maybe defer to folks in the Office for Intellectual Freedom or who are more academically well-versed in these sorts of things than I am to say what you should do. But I also don't think that it's a huge lift to ask them to examine the entire resource before they can file a challenge about something. Steph, do you want to answer the first question?
How do you avoid self-censorship, either out of fear for yourself, your job, etc.? You want to fight the impulse, but the anxiety is real. The anxiety is real. I feel like there's a lot of, I feel like when you have it in writing saying, like, we're adhering to these principles of intellectual freedom, we firmly believe in the freedom to read, and that there's a real benefit to open access of materials. And if you continuously are like reminding yourself of that, you know that you're not alone. There's a lot of resources. Maybe that's when you call up a friend or send an email or like follow on social media someone who is in the field, and they can help you manage your anxiety about it and support you in going through with the professionally ethical choice, maybe.
I would agree that that is really hard. And I think in my experience, I've had it where staff were the ones who were self-censoring or were uncomfortable collecting certain types of materials. And I, as a director, had to, in the middle of a like highly contentious environment with my board, with my city, with my community, decide how much I was going to push against that. And so those are conversations that, you know, you should have as library workers with other members of your library staff. You should, talk about in your one-on-ones with your director, or your director should be talking to the board about, like, if we face these kinds of things, if we face a library staff member, because if we were to go all the way back to like the third slide that had the statistics, challenges are coming, the calls coming from inside the house sometimes. Challenges are coming from library workers, or attempts to censor or restrict access are coming from library workers, library boards. It's not just the big bad members of the public. But I think that you should have conversations about what is and is not acceptable, what will be allowed, and what is cause for reprimand potentially. Yeah, I feel like I've lost my train of thought a little bit, but it can be really difficult to be in a situation where you are afraid of making certain decisions, or other people are pushing back against those decisions. I will also say that in all of the time that I did direct support for libraries, so talking on the phone with folks who were facing a challenge or facing conflict with their board, I would always take the opportunity to tell them that I am going to tell you what our professional opinion is, what the party line from ALA, from all of us as members who are guiding those recommendations. I'm going to tell you what the most legally defensible and professionally ethical path forward is for you. But I am not ever going to judge you for not being able to put your job on the line, because that is a luxury a lot of us, most of us, do not have. And you work for your board, you work for your school, you work for your superintendent, you work for your organization, and if they will not back you, then that is a different conversation that you need to have with yourself about whether you can continue working there. But even that, changing jobs is a luxury some of us don't have. So I think we're all just trying to do our best in the situation that we're in, and trying to make decisions that serve our community in the best way that we can based on the situation that we're in. Okay, long answer. Why include an option for appealing at all is the next question. That almost seems like the process that is done is not respected and wasted work. I think that including an appeal is important because of where the final responsibility for the collection lies. So the board in a public library setting, which is my perspective here, the board of the library is ultimately responsible for the collection. And for those decisions. That responsibility gets delegated to the director, and then from the director often gets delegated to other staff. But really, the final responsibility is with the board. So you may have it written that just because it's the board's decision or the board's responsibility, you have the challenge go directly to them. I wouldn't recommend that, because we don't all have great boards, and boards are not steeped in the requirements of our profession in the way that library workers are. So I would prefer to have a committee make a recommendation made up of, 3, 4, 5 library professionals, and then a final decision made by the person who has been hired to run the actual library. And then it makes it a little bit harder. It should make it a little harder for boards to reject all of those recommendations out of hand upon appeal. It also just keeps your board from having to deal with things that can become more contentious. But Sam Helmick, who is the current ALA president, told me this once upon a time, and it is something that I've really held on to, is that we are a part of our local government, and it is the right of the members of our community to bring their complaints to us as their local government, and to have us be responsible to them. And that having a formal challenge process is respecting the rights of our community members. And I think that reframing a complaint, and keeping that perspective in mind can really reframe the way that the whole experience of going through a challenge can feel. If it is not so much, this person thinks I'm terrible and made a bad decision and like I'm ruining our community, but it's more this is a member of the public who has a right to engage with their government and to bring their complaints to their government. And so if you come at it from a right that they have that you should respect, that helps me. I hope it helps you someday, but that perspective has really been helpful to me as I've gone through challenges and helped other folks through challenges as well.
Yeah, I think dissent is kind of the cornerstone of any of these kinds of like democratic processes. You need to be respectful of the dissent. That is intellectual freedom.
Agreed. Okay, we have one more question in the Q&A. So if you have any more questions, please add them. We've got a few more minutes. How do you recommend limiting the number of challenges that pressure groups initiate? We want to hear legitimate concerns, but are worried that the language around limiting the number of challenges doesn't sound right. I think that you can put limits on how quickly you process them. Might be the easiest and least kind of limiting way. They can submit 100 challenges if they want. It's just going to take you forever to get through all of them. And they're free to rescind them if they get bored. I believe there are some libraries that do have a, like, kind of the way that you have interlibrary loan restrictions, like you can only have 3 open loans or loan requests at one time. You can challenge things. You can have 3 challenges going at once. You can submit one more when we have resolved one of them. And we just take them in the order that they are received. And that way you don't have like a pressure group who is just flooding you and keeping other legitimate concerns from other people from coming in. So again, check with your city attorney, check with OIF, check with your state law librarian about how legal those kinds of restrictions are in your state. But there are some ways that you can kind of throttle, I guess, the speed with which those challenges come in.
And we do have another question. Rather than challenging books, our patrons have taken to hiding books at the library, behind or under shelving, etc. Are there good policies for these behaviors and what can be done? I mean, it does feel like if you have a user behavior, like that you will be respectful of the books and the way that they're shelved. And yes, I'm sorry if that's a lot of books that you end up having to reshelf.
I think that's something that can be addressed in your conduct policy as well. Like that behavior like that interferes with the ability of other users to access library resources and is disruptive. And so if you know that those kinds of things are happening, and if you can narrow down through staff observation who it is that's engaging in those behaviors, that can be addressed. But yes, it is very frustrating. Unfortunately, the answer is probably just walking around the library more, which is, takes away from other tasks, and we don't want to be the, the shelving police or anything like that. But yeah, we dealt with that as well in a library that I worked in. There was some kind of anti-religious text that kept finding its way into the men's room bathroom trash. Luckily, we had RFID, so our custodian just started walking the trash out through between the gates, so it would beep at him. But once you notice that something is happening, then you can be a little creative in trying to address that. What if a member of the public has requested a book for a collection that later gets challenged? Should you provide for that in a policy? I don't know that needs to be like that direct relationship between requested by a patron and challenged by another patron needs to be addressed in policy specifically, because I think that you should address collection requests specifically and reconsideration specifically. Just because someone requested it and just because you ended up purchasing it doesn't mean that you followed all of your policies when you did it. When I was going through challenges in my library, I had to onboard a brand new board member the day before a challenge was being considered by the board. And actually it was before they were even officially city council approved. And I remember sitting in my office with them and saying, the only thing you are considering It has nothing to do with the content of the book. What you are considering is whether we followed policy when we acquired this book and whether it adheres to policy now. So I think that whether an item was requested or not, what really matters is whether that item or resource is acceptable based on your collection policies. I hope that answers your question.
At what point is a book legally allowed to be removed from a library shelf? At the complaint, the challenge, or ban? I would say legally allowed varies depending on your library type to start. And so I would say like removing the book from the library shelf is a ban. And so that's more the result than the like level. I feel like I'm not describing this well.
I would say, like, kind of reflecting back on the answer that I gave to the previous question is, if a material or a resource does not fit your policy and does not meet that criteria, then I think that could be removed in good faith, right? If our library somehow realized that we accidentally added some textbooks and we're like, hey, this really does not fit the needs of, or the purpose of our collection, we're going to, and some patron brings it up to us, like this is kind of a far-fetched example, but like a patron brings this up to us because they're offended that we have, OBGYN 2025, lots of illustrations or whatever. And we're like, actually, you're right. This does not fit our collection development policy and the purpose of our collection because we don't collect textbooks. Like we could say, yeah, you know what, you're right. We're going to remove this. But we wouldn't be removing it because the graphic illustrations, we'd be removing it because it doesn't fit our collection development policy. I know a library that they accidentally purchased the unrated version of an extremely gory film whose name escapes me, and their policy allowed for the collection of rated materials. I don't remember, this was a very long time ago, but like they realized, you know what, actually, yeah, we did not intend to purchase this. We're going to purchase the thing that we intended to purchase and replace it, but thank you for bringing this to our attention. Ideally, nothing should ever be removed based on the content, based on the author and the background of the author, and people's personal opinions about that. If a patron brings up a book and they're like, hey, this has potentially dangerous, inaccurate information, and I don't think it should be here anymore, then you should consider that in light of your collection development policy and what you believe about the accuracy or differing viewpoints about things. So it's not that there are never situations where something might be removed based on a patron saying, hey, I don't think this should be here. But it's really important to understand why that decision might be made and make sure that it is made in a content neutral way and that it's just based entirely on whatever applicable policy you have, whether it's a display or a program or any other type of service that you provide. How to deal with people who ban books because they check them out and never return them. I would automate reports for your library. I think, it's really easy for whoever it is that handles overdue calls and letters to be the only one to see that. And for once they get past the, well, we charged them point, that no one ever hears about it again. I think that long overdue is something that you should be, like that long overdue report is something you should be looking at for a while and checking for potential patterns there. I know that there are libraries where things like Hide the Pride have happened, where all of the books get checked out and just are then not available beyond display. One way that you can combat that is by having digital versions of your lists. So like maybe you have the cover of the book printed out with a QR code for like, look how popular this book is. Do you want to put it on hold? You know, so you're still advertising that the resource is available. You're adding a way for people to get on the hold list, even though that particular material is not in place. Also, if someone checks out your materials and does not return them after a certain amount of time, that is theft. And once it hits a certain dollar amount, that should be handled by your local law enforcement. And it's not usually fun to have to hand those off because it just kind of feels yucky sometimes, but that is the legal recourse that we have, and theft of public materials and public items should be addressed and not just let go.
All right. I feel like we could continue this conversation for quite a long time. We're going to be sure that Steph and Amanda get all of the questions that were not answered live that they can follow up on in the days to come. And we want to remind everyone that tomorrow you'll get an email that has all of the info, again, that was covered today, along with clickable links in the presentation. Thank you so much, Steph and Amanda, for this wonderful presentation, just chock full of information, so useful. We're going to take a little bit of a break before our next workshop, which is You've Received a Challenge, Now What?, which is the natural next step after this presentation here. It's going to begin in a few minutes. We are going to close the chat during this little bit of a break, but we will open it up again before the next session. While you wait, please enjoy these resources from our sponsor, Penguin Random House Library Marketing. See you in a few minutes.